Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the beneficiary principle, which critically will analyze the extent to which this principle is unnecessarily rigid. Now, to understand the principle, we must begin to understand how a trust works, the parties involved. The core of a private trust lies within the fact that the testator aims to pass on assets to the beneficiary. This is done within the help of a trustee. The three parties involved are the testator, the testee, and the beneficiary. However, there exists a trust called a non-charitable purpose trust. Now, what is it? The purpose of such a trust is to achieve a specific purpose rather than it being for the gain for a group of people. However, the courts have generally refused the enforcement of such trust as they lack human beneficiaries, as well as the fact that they go against the rule of perpetuity. This video will explore the beneficiary principle and its exceptions regarding to such trusts. Now, we mentioned the rule of perpetuity. Let us dive into what it actually is. One of the reasons why courts tend to reject a non-charitable trust is this rule. This is basically a rule which limits the assets being held in a trust for too long. It states after a certain period of time, the beneficiary is indeed entitled to the assets within the trust. The rationale for this plays out within a twofold scenario. The first is that within society, it is not economically beneficial to have such assets frozen for a long period. And second is, why should the dead and not the living be entitled to the usage of the assets of the trust? Now, let's explore more on what the beneficiary principle is. This is an idea that revolves around the fact that there must be a human beneficiary on the receiving end of the trust for it to be enforceable. This is due to the fact that the distribution of equitable and legal rights within a trust. The idea is that when a trust comes into action as per the law of equity, a beneficiary normally gains equitable rights, while the trustee gains legal rights. The rights of the beneficiary are reflected within the case of Saunders v. Vautier, where the key principle outlined was that the beneficiary gains equitable property rights, also known as in rem rights, allowing the beneficiary to gain any trust property which lies within the hands of any third party, as well as giving the beneficiary proper locus standi to bring a case to the court of law to hold the trustee accountable. This, however, does not apply to the bona fide purchaser without value, or otherwise known as equity's darling. Furthermore, the principle of Saunders v. Vautier was later implemented in the case of Hall's resettlement, where Megarry Justice stated that the beneficiary also had rights to dispose of the trust property as they thought fit, for as in equity, the property was theirs. Thus, the beneficiary principle was implemented. Looking at the previous slide, the case of Morris v. Bishop of Durham also implemented that there shall be no trust over which the court seems no control. The beneficiary principle prevents the controllable power of disposition. This outlines how the core of the beneficiary principle revolves around enforceability in relation to the rights of the beneficiary, as well as the reasonabilities of the trustee to keep the property for the beneficiary. It can be summed up in one simple equation: no rights equals no enforceable trust. More so, the case also outlined that in the case of a gift, there is no beneficiary. If there is no beneficiary or object mentioned, regardless of the discretion placed in the trustee, the trust will fail. One can also say that there are two fundamental parts of the beneficiary principle: the rights and the enforcer principle. The former states the traditional view that a beneficiary must hold actual equitable rights against the trustee. Without an identifiable beneficiary, there are no rights. Now, for the second part is a little bit of a liberal part to the beneficiary rule. The enforcer principle shows that how, despite there being no clear beneficiary in the event of a purpose trust, if there is somebody specific to dispose and enforce the purpose of that trust, it will be considered valid. There are some exceptions which will be later on discussed. Now, when looking at the application of the beneficiary principle, the case of Reaster Settlement Trust can be important. The trust initially failed because the intended income was not charitable, and it was benefiting a group of individuals which nobody could enforce. As seen on the previous slide, this actually applies the enforcer principle. In the case of this, it was said that no specific person could enforce the trust. Additionally, there was no difference between a settlement and a will. That's what the courts found. Trusts had The trust had objects void for uncertainty. This case is an example where it set the beneficiary principle as precedent for future cases. Another key point that this brings to attention is that equity cannot step in when there is nobody to enforce the law, thus validating that non-charitable trusts without beneficiaries are invalid. However, there are narrow exceptions. Moving on, the second case of Reshaw says that a trust was valid, however not enforceable, as there was no beneficiary to impose it. The aim of the trust was to change the English alphabet, which was said not to be a charitable case. The case furthermore confirms that non-charitable purpose trusts without beneficiaries also generally fail. Finally, the case of Re Endicott. It reaffirmed that the beneficiary principle was invalidated as it was invalidated non-charitable purpose trusts, and it is not also within the umbrella of said recognized exceptions. Now, what are these exceptions? Firstly, the case of Reed Denley, here it was mentioned that as long as there are an identifiable group of individuals who directly have interests in the trust have adequate locus standi to enforce it. When looking at the case of the Reed Denley trust deed, the courts ruled that the trust was valid as there was an identifiable group of people who benefit from the trust. These people were employees of the company. Furthermore, the case was an integral in laying out the principles of exceptions as the ruling liberalized the rules of a purpose trust. In the details of the case, the words including in the class such other persons as the trustee might allow created valid power to the trustees, and it was not a requisite to the validity of the power that all possible trusts should be ascertainable. Moving on to another exception can be seen in Lipinski's will trust. The court here set precedents on the rule concerning the beneficiary principle and the gifts to unincorporated associations. Here, Justice Olivery held the ratio dissenti that in Re Henley for construing purpose trusts as trusts for the benefit of individuals when possible. Additionally, it was also ruled that the trust was valid despite the beneficiary having predeceased the testator. This was because the beneficiaries had power to make capital for their own, and in this case, which in this case was Hull Juding's Association, which was an absolute beneficiary. Moving on, in the Rees Sanderson's trust, it involves a gift. The trust was made by the testator towards the maintenance and upkeeping of his brother. However, upon the brother's death, it was nevertheless held that the whole balance went to the brother's estate, as he had the right to such when he was alive. He was alive. So it was said that he had the right towards the trust property from the testatees. However, only up to the maintenance and upkeeping and no more. Upon completion, any extra money went towards the residuary beneficiaries. Now, in the Reandrews Trust, despite there being no beneficiary of surplus beyond the sole reason of the trust, which was the children's education, all the children still received all surplus in equal. This was because the term of education was construed in a broad way. Thus, education was not exhausted when the children reached a certain age. Additionally, the intention of the testator was taken into consideration as well, such that the children needed to be provided for in the most useful manner. Here we can see that there will be no resulting trust of the surplus money on the concept of the broad interpretation of education, as well as the testator's true intention. Now, taking a look at Malaysian cases, it can be seen with Ri Chino Ke Hu, where the council argued that a non-charitable trust is a gift may be valid where it was expressed for a specific purpose and such purpose was well defined. However, if the testator expresses his intentions vaguely, the gift was void for uncertainty. This rule can be also applied in the English case of the Rees Sandersons, where the court held that a special purpose is assigned for a gift if the court considers the gift absolute. The gift takes effect as to the whole sum. Now, in the case of trusts of imperfect obligation, it can be seen that there are two: monuments or graves, as well as specific animals. Now, when looking at monuments or graves, it can be seen in the case of Masset v. Bingle that it allows the validity of a non-charitable trust to be carried out despite there being no human beneficiary. In this case, the testator made two gifts by way of trust, and it was 300 to erect a building and 200 to provide for upcoming income. Now, the 300 was held valid as it was within the rule of perpetuity, but the 200 was not, as it was an indefinite period and it went against the rule of perpetuity. Coming to specific animals, the case of Re Wedgwood highlights that any trust which promotes kindness, humanity, and morality will be qualified as a charitable trust. Furthermore, in the case of Re Kelly, it clarifies that the terms lives should be referred to humans and not animals. Now, on looking at an unincorporated association, this is an unincorporated association is held in a trust as it lacks recognition as a legal entity. It is for this reason it is usually kept within a trust, and in this scenario the beneficiaries are the members of the association. Most scenarios of unincorporated associations, the property is usually kept depends on the gift and the constitutional rules of the unincorporated association's members. The case of Conservative and Union Central Office v. Brunel defines an unincorporated association as an organization which has rules identifying in whom the control of it and the funds vested, as well as there being two or more persons bound together by mutual undertakings and have mutual duties and obligations. There are primarily two types of unincorporated trusts. These are trusts, associations, charitable purposes, and non-charitable purposes. Looking at a charitable purpose fund. So these are trusts that do not apply the beneficiary principle. The rule against perpetuity and the requirement of certainty of objects within an express trust. In the case of Within the case of Re Heatherton, it was held that the trust was indeed a charitable gift, for the saying of masses in church was prima facie charitable due to public benefit obtained for religious reasons. However, as seen in the case of Opinhium v. Tobacco Securities Trust, it made clear that a charitable trust should contain an element of public benefit. More so, if it is an educational or other type of trust which benefits the community, it would only be charitable if the class of beneficiaries would be seen as a section of the community. Now, moving on to the case of Reholdy's Town Football, it depicts that regardless of there being no clear beneficiaries, rather it was invalid that as all members of the football club had equitable members of the club, that the land had to be held on trust by the members by the testees in accordance with the club rules. The case of Morris v. Bishop of Durham, there was a ruling saying that the purposes are considered charitable, which that the statute allows or which have purpose of public benefit. This further proves the need for public benefit for a charitable trust to be valid. The case of Blair v. Duncan states that the trust asset must be clearly written in a certain manner, as contrasted in a non-charitable purpose trust. The case of purpose of income tax v. Pemsel, it set out that the real meaning of charity, such that that charity in its legal sense comprised of four main parts: trust for the relief of poverty, trust for the advancement of education, trusts for the advancements of religion, and trusts for other purposes which are genuinely beneficial to community. Now, when looking at the conclusion, what is the conclusion to this all? The rights of the beneficiaries have been outlined in the case of Saunders v. Vautier. However, when trying to understand a purpose trust where the beneficiary is not a human, courts have been quite strict on the validity and enforceability of such trusts. Now, Re-Astor settlement, Re-Astor settlement, and the cases such as Re-Endicott, such cases prove that non-charitable purpose trusts generally fail for enforcement, thus following the beneficiary principle. Now, general exceptions to the rule are Thus, there are general exceptions to the rule, thus allowing non-human beneficiaries to undergo a valid trust. Such include charitable purpose trusts, gifts to unincorporated associations, and trusts of imperfect obligations. So, in the ordinary traditional view, without a beneficiary, the trust normally fails. However, there are many circumventing scenarios where such trusts can be enforced without a human beneficiary.